Hello, this is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology. Today's lecture is on Peter Abelard, a very interesting and creative philosopher of the 12th century. The material draws upon the work of Peter King's article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, so I have to say that. I, of course, have read some Abelard, and I do find him to be quite an interesting figure. So I will be adding things here and there. Born in 1079 in Le Palais, a small town near Nantes. Yeah, so goes my French. Anyway, it's in France, and when he was young, of course, he read well. Cicero, Horace, Ovid, Seneca. He went off and studied with a couple masters of his day, the nominalist, Roscelin, and the realist, William of Champeaux. In about 1110, he was 31 years old, he entered into debate with William of Champeaux over the reality of universals. He thought he won that debate quite handily. He always had a very high view of his own ability, and by all accounts, the guy was just an astoundingly talented guy in many fields, and quite a musician as well. He studied theology with Anselm of Laon. This is not Anselm that we talked about last time, the great Saint Anselm. This is another Anselm. But he did not like the traditional methods Anselm used. This would be the so-called anti-dialectical methods. He became a scholar in residence at Notre Dame and had an affair with Heloise. Actually, they were married. And this was quite a fine romance, right? You can see him there. He was quite infatuated with her, and she was quite infatuated with him. And we can read their letters. Of course, there was a little problem here. And he actually was castrated, right? We'll just speak it like it is. Try to keep the family of Heloise wanted him to stay away. So castrating him seemed like the way to make that happen. But their love was deeper than mere sexual love, obviously, and they continued to write each other in these wonderful love letters. So it's quite a deal. After he recovered from his injuries, and I don't know how that would happen, he began teaching on theology and the Trinity. I grew up on a farm, so I know about castrating animals. It's a tough deal. Certainly when you get older, it would be bad. His philosophical approach, we don't need to talk about this anymore. His philosophical approach to matters was condemned at the Synod of Soissons. Soissons, there we go. The Synod, anyway, that Synod. And he taught then, after this condemnation, at an oratory constructed for him, named the Paraclete. That's a wonderful name. And so he was out there in the countryside teaching. Later on, he became the abbot of Saint-Gildas at Rouen in Brittany. But of course, the monks disliked him. I'm sure they did. This guy was not, a real humble guy, right? Yeah, he returned to Paris in the 1130s and taught, where he came into conflict with Bernard of Clairvaux, and they had quite a controversy. A supposed debate between Abelard and Bernard was to happen in 1140, but Abelard had heard that Bernard had rigged this, so he refused to take part. Well, Bernard appealed to the Pope, and then later, maybe Abelard appealed first, I don't remember. They each appealed to the Pope, and the Pope sided with Bernard at the beginning. Later, he lifted his denouncement. So, Abelard died in 1142. His students included 3 popes and several heads of state. Students loved the guy, you know. Abelard is, however, in the literature not referred to as frequently as he ought to be, probably because of this verdict of Soissons cast a cloud over him. So there you go. His works, well, they're hard to catalog because there are differing versions of them. Some of them seem to be more like teaching notes rather than actual written works. He wrote on dialectic, that is, on logic, philosophy of language, metaphysics, philosophy of mind. It certainly wasn't called philosophy of mind, but he was dealing with these issues. He wrote on ethics. He wrote on philosophical theology. He was the first to use the term Theology. Right? He wrote the Sich et Non, which was a very important book, giving the opinion on this side and the opinion on this side, yes and no, right? This was very, very influential in its time, and one can trace perhaps the beginnings of the scholastic method here to this work. It's not an intensely creative work, given all the other work that he did, that was really quite creative. There are allusions in his writings to his other works on grammar, rhetoric, and even a commentary on Ezekiel, but we have none of these. If they existed, they must have been lost. Okay, we'll talk first about his metaphysics. Well, he's the first great nominalist, right? Might be better to say he's the first great irrealist with respect to all kinds of entities that the tradition had held to exist. For instance, universals. The idea being that, of course, there is a thing that can be in 2 places at the same time, whiteness, for instance. Or propositions, that there is a proposition that sentences somehow state, events, times, natural kinds, relations, wholes, the notion of absolute space. He was a deflationist. A deflationist is one who takes the wind out of the sails of one who had such a bloated ontology as having universals and propositions and events. He's an irrealist on these things because he did not see any deep grounds for claiming that they exist, nor did he see why they needed to exist to get done the kinds of things that philosophy gets done. He preferred reductivist accounts, atomist, and even materialist explanations. Basically, he held that a universal is not an ontological feature of the world, but a semantic feature of language. Certainly, we can talk as if whiteness is here and there, but when we say that this is white and that is white, do we mean that there is something called whiteness that's there and that very same whiteness is there? He would say no. There is not such a thing as animal that can be there or there. And he's got some really ingenious arguments to show this. For instance, he argues that animal cannot be both there in a man and over there in an ass. An ass, of course, there were a lot of asses around in those days, right? And you put things on these asses and they would carry them to town and back to the farm. So we find in the medieval literature oftentimes examples in philosophical literature of the ass. So he argues that animals cannot both be in a man and an ass. Why? Well, because the thing would then be both rational and irrational. If animal, okay, so you got an animal here, see. There's animal. We're going to say it's a animal. It's a universal. That is to say, it exists in an ass, in a man, Okay, well, now this one thing that exists in both the ass and the man over here, because man is rational, it's rational, and over here, because an ass is irrational, yes, an ass is irrational, it's irrational. So then we would have animal being both rational and irrational at the same time. Well, nothing can hold contradictory attributes. Therefore, it cannot be the case that there is some universal animal that is instantiated both in an ass and a man. Well, of course, there are lots of comebacks to that. The thing about Abelard is he was really good on his feet. By all accounts, he never lost a debate. Of course, many of these accounts are his accounts, but he was quite well known for being just excellent in debate, and any type of objection he often took care of right at the moment. His reasoning is often quite sophisticated. So he held that a universal, like animal, is merely a semantically general term that refers to a disjunction of individuals, right? Animal can refer to Ralph the man and Donald the ass. It's a disjunction of individuals. Now, we're going to see that this kind of move is very standard in the Middle Ages for those who are advancing a more nominalist view of things. All things apart from God are either form or matter, or a composite of the two. Material elements are composed, right, of the four elements. We go back to our good friend, you all remember, right? Yes, Empedocles, right? Earth, air, fire, and water, right? Earth, air, fire, and water. So the material elements are composed of these. The form of something is the configuration of its material parts. Now, this is really an interesting claim for a guy back in the 12th century to have. The form is the configuration of its parts. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's say we have these kinds of parts here, X, Y, Z. That's going to have a different form than X, Z, Y, X, which will have a different form as Y, Z, X, X, right? These configurations are different. We could talk about the forms up here, if you will. And the forms would be, in some sense, a function of the configurations down below. This is known in the literature of philosophy today, or you could think about this according to the so-called supervenience relationship, where this realm here would be your subvenient realm, and this would be your supervenient realm. And the idea is that certain properties happen as a function of a change in underlying properties. So these forms are present as a function of which configurations are present. The idea is that two configurational replicas must have the same form, or there cannot be a formal difference without a configurational difference. It's very interesting claim. My goodness, I don't know what happened here. It's a very interesting claim, and it really sets him, I mean, very almost spooky in his in that claim, how modern that could be, or post, well, I don't know what period of philosophy, but certainly in the analytical tradition, I wouldn't say we're in a postmodern phase necessarily. Anyway. The human soul is immaterial and mortal. and immortal, not immortal, immaterial and immortal, according to Abelard, and does not, therefore, supervene on matter. So he would not be what you would call a non-reductive physicalist. The soul exists apart from matter. So he's a dualist at this point. However, most structured wholes are simply reducible to their material parts. Okay, so this is the question here is the question of Mariology. I'll put that term on the board. Mariology deals with the notion of a whole and how the whole is related to the parts. And he would say that most wholes are reducible to their parts, the configuration of their parts. He claimed that individuals have natures, and these natures that each individual has are not shared with others. So an individual has a nature, and these natures belong to natural kinds, although he's not a bloated ontologist, as we've talked about with respect to natural kinds. Natural kinds, like sheep, are merely collections of things having common features. Okay, so maybe, okay, so sheep. Avis is a sheep. Can you see that? Avis is a sheep. It says Avis is a sheep. Now, Plato, or in the tradition, we might say that the property of sheep, right, is associatable with Avis, that it is instantiated in Avis, property of sheep. I don't want to use the word present in because that makes it an accident, and it's actually a secondary substance. So the property of sheepness is present in Avis, and then we have Emma. Emma is also a sheep. The property of sheepness is present in Emma as well. But his view of this is that a natural kind would be like sheep, are merely collections of things having common features. So that means that sheep just is all of those things that are individual sheep. So we got Avis in there, we got B, C. There's a lot of sheep in the world, but there's Emma there. See, that's E, F, oh, a whole bunch of sheep, right? So to say that Avis is a sheep, if you think about it, would be to say that Avis, right, is a member of the set of those things that are sheep. And this, of course, should not be any news to you if you've already got Avis over there. Avis is in that class. This could be known as a resemblance class nominalism, perhaps. And of course, with any resemblance class nominalism, natural kinds are merely collections of things having common features. The question immediately arises, well, how do you know that those features are in common? Okay, so this is your class of sheep. They have common features. Well, now explain that, right? You're saying that sheep just is this class of things having common features. Well, that's very nice. But now explain the common feature relationship. These are the kinds of moves that one sees in those who do metaphysics well. They think through these things. So anyway, it would seem if you're a natural kind reductionist in this way, like Abelard's suggesting, that the world is divided into discrete similarity classes, right? You could even talk about equivalence classes here. An equivalence class actually divides a set. Say you have a set of this, and an equivalence class, you divide it in a set of disjoint classes, each thing in those classes being equivalent to itself. equal to itself, which means they're transitive with respect to themselves, symmetrical with respect to themselves, and reflexive with respect to themselves. This may be more than you want to know, but that's how one might go about that. So similarity is not a relation with ontological status with Peter Abelard, but is reducible to things that basically are similar. Well, there you go. Certain kinds of metaphysicians are going to say, well, this is as circular could be. Okay, similarity is not a relation, but it's just merely reducible to things that are similar. Thank you very much. You know? Okay, he's the greatest logician since antiquity, and what he is so astoundingly contemporary is that he nicely distinguishes the content of a proposition from its assertion, and of course Frege did this in his Begriffsschrift. He has a theory of entailment. Okay, now you got to understand that the word entailment means something different than either inference, material implication, or what we might call logical implication. And I don't want to get into all of these matters, but entailment is a special kind of logical implication in which you have a relevance rule, right? So, for instance, the paradoxes of strict implication would say that any thing follows at all from an essential falsehood, right? That something necessary, all kinds of necessary truths follow from things that are impossible. That's not an entailment, because the impossibility of the moon being the sun at the same time, the moon is the moon while the moon is being the sun, and the sun is being the sun. The impossibility of that does not entail 2 + 2 = 4. It may strictly imply it, but it does not entail it. Why? Because there's no connection in meaning, if you will, between the premise and the conclusion. He claims that the sense of the conclusion must somehow be contained in the sense of the premises. And when we talk about sense here, we're talking about something we talked about earlier on, the notion of an intention. Remember our distinction? All of you budding theologians out there, you have to think each day about the distinction between an intention and an extension, right? The extension of a term is that to which the term refers. The intention of the term consists in those properties which, or that by virtue of which, the term applies to the thing. So we would think about that normally as the sense picks out the thing. And of course, classically, Frege in the Begriff, Frege, of course, argues this in the famous example of the evening star having a different sense than the morning star, but they each refer to or pick out the same object in the world, which is Venus. Okay. So anyway, he's talking about a sense here, which is more like an intention. An entailment is perfecta, that is complete, when it holds by virtue of its logical form, complexio, under a uniform substitution of terms. Now, I don't want you to think that this is too complicated to understand. This is actually basic logic. If you have an argument, and you have the argument where you have a number of variables now in it, let's say we don't know what P means, but it can mean a whole bunch of things. We don't know what Q means, but it can mean a whole bunch of things. And again, we don't know what P and Q mean, but we are going to say that P and Q give R. Then if we have, now we can conclude R, right? Now we don't know what any of these things are referring to, But we know that any uniform substitution of values here is going to be a substitution which this turns out true, right? So this is true by the logical form alone, if you will. So a uniform substitution of terms is a substitution into its logical form. So he uses the categorical syllogism of Aristotle, and we mentioned, or at least, we touched upon the hypothetical syllogism of Boethius. And there are examples of complete entailments, according to our good friend Abelard. There are arguments that are not formally valid, he says, that is, complete entailments, but yet have necessary conclusions relevant to the present premises. So, I mean, he gets into this stuff pretty deep. He uses topical inferences out of the Topics of Aristotle to reason from S as a man to S as an animal. Notice that you can't get from S as a man to S as an animal by a categorical logic or through a logical form alone, right? But we all know that if S is a man, S is an animal. Why? Because all men are animals. But that would be an example of what was called in the day a topical inference. It's not strictly logical, but it has to do with what we might now call meaning postulates, how the word man relates to the word animal. However, in the day, this theory of topical inference seemed to lead to inconsistent results. And thus we see that we had a 12th century crisis of the theory of inference. So we're going to stop right at this point. We'll come back with Abelard on his philosophy of language. This is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt from the Christ School of Theology, and we'll see you soon.